The stage lights flared to life, casting a polished golden hue across the slick floor of the Truth Talk Live set. The audience buzzed, not with laughter, but tension. This wasn't Family Feud. This wasn't a comedy monologue. And Denzel Washington wasn't here to entertain. Denzel leaned forward, eyes cold and voice low. You know what's funny, Steve? Every time we try to talk about real pain, you crack a joke. Every time someone bleeds, you've got a punchline ready. Steve Harvey chuckled nervously, brushing off Denzel's intensity with a practiced smile. Brother, people come here to laugh. You can't be mad at a man for bringing a little joy. But Denzel didn't blink. It's not joy when it comes at the expense of truth. You clown for the crowd, and they forget we're still in chains. You dance while the fire's still burning behind us. The audience hushed. The laughter that usually followed Steve like a shadow was nowhere to be found. Even the producers behind the cameras seemed frozen. Steve's smile twitched. You act like I ain't from the same streets, like I haven't seen struggle. And you sell that struggle for applause, Denzel shot back, voice rising. You polished it, packaged it, and now you serve it as entertainment. You're not honoring our pain, you're monetizing it. The silence was suffocating. Steve sat back, arms crossed now, eyes narrowing. So what, now I'm the problem? Because I use humor to survive? No, Denzel said, standing taller. You become the problem when you laugh to avoid truth. Survival is one thing. Selling out is another. Gasps echoed through the audience. This wasn't just a disagreement. It was a cultural reckoning, broadcast live, raw, and too real to ignore. Steve Harvey shifted in his chair, his trademark charisma now muted beneath a tightening jaw. He looked out toward the audience, searching for something, approval, support, or maybe just a second to breathe. Let me tell you something, Denzel, he said finally, his voice dipped in irritation. You think just because you're the serious guy, you get to stand on that pedestal and talk down to me? Denzel didn't flinch. No pedestal, Steve. Just tired of seeing the truth get buried beneath your punchlines. Steve's lips curled, his smile now sharp. You ever think maybe those punchlines saved somebody's life? Maybe when a kid watched me crack that joke, he didn't pick up a gun. Denzel raised an eyebrow. And maybe when that same kid needed someone to speak raw, unfiltered truth, all he got was another laugh track. A ripple of murmurs passed through the audience. The moderator tried to interject. Gentlemen, if we could. Denzel held up a hand, never breaking eye contact with Steve. You built your empire making us laugh while we bled. But now we're bleeding louder. You gonna crack a joke about that too? Steve leaned forward, the smile finally gone. You don't know what it cost me to get here. I do, Denzel replied coldly. Because I walked too. But I didn't sell my walk for applause. I earned respect without putting on a costume. The room went dead still. You call this a costume? Steve snapped, gesturing to his suit. This is me. This is survival. No, Denzel said slowly, that's camouflage. It landed like a slap. The kind of silence that follows a door being slammed shut filled the studio. Even those in the back rows were visibly leaning forward, breath held. Denzel's voice softened, not in tone, but in precision. I'm not saying you never helped people. I'm saying you stopped holding the mirror up. And you started shining lights away from the cracks. Steve looked away for the first time. And just like that, the crowd wasn't watching a talk show anymore. They were watching a war of legacies. Steve exhaled, slow and heavy, as if the weight of years had suddenly settled on his shoulders. He wasn't used to being on the defensive. Not here. Not on his own turf. He stared at Denzel and muttered, "You think you're better than me." Denzel blinked once. "No. I think you forgot who you are." Steve flinched. The audience murmured again, a live pulse of discomfort moving through the seats. This wasn't the usual roast or talk show banter. This was soul deep. I haven't forgotten anything, Steve said, his voice low and shaking slightly. I grew up watching my mom clean houses. I had nothing. You act like I haven't earned every damn laugh I gave this world. Denzel nodded slowly. You earned your way out, no doubt. But now you're building ladders that only go halfway up. And the rest of us? We fall off before we make it. Steve looked confused. What the hell does that mean? It means, Denzel said, his tone sharpening, you inspire people just enough to keep them hopeful, but never enough to make them angry. Never enough to make them act. Steve clenched his fists. Maybe people don't want to be angry. Maybe they want to forget. And that's the problem. Denzel thundered, rising slightly from his chair. You help them forget, not heal. You entertain their pain into silence. Gasps filled the room. A few claps even broke out, subtle, but real. Steve rose too now, face flushed. And what do you do, Denzel? Huh? You play heroes in movies and give speeches at banquets. What makes you any different? I don't need to be different, Denzel said quietly. I just refuse to laugh when my people are crying. The moderator sat frozen, the producers visibly panicked. This wasn't the segment they'd rehearsed. Steve swallowed hard. You ever think people need laughter to survive? And I think they need truth to live, Denzel answered. The line hit the studio like a thunderclap. Suddenly, this wasn't about fame, or careers, or even respect. It was about purpose. And both men knew, only one would walk away with the audience's soul. Steve stepped back slightly, hands on his hips, breathing heavy. His usual command of the room was slipping. The spotlight that once celebrated his charisma now felt like a heat lamp under interrogation. Let me ask you something, Denzel, he said finally. Why is it always the funny black man who gets called a sellout? You don't say that to the rappers glorifying violence. Or the athletes staying silent. It's the comedian who gets burned at the stake. Denzel didn't hesitate. Because comedy gets invited into the living room. It's trusted. And when you're trusted, you've got a responsibility not to use that trust to distract from reality. Steve scoffed. So what, now I'm a distraction? When you use humor to dodge truth, yes, Denzel said firmly. You have power, Steve. The kind of power that doesn't need a podium. But lately, you've used it to make people laugh instead of make them look. A slow silence crept over the studio again. This wasn't a takedown. This was a call to wake up. Steve's eyes softened, just for a moment. You know what's crazy? I remember the first time I saw you act. You didn't say much. You didn't have to. You stood there, and people listened. I admired that. Denzel leaned in. Then you understand what I'm doing now. Yeah, Steve said. But I don't know if you understand what it's like when people expect you to be the light in a room full of darkness, every damn day. That's the job, Denzel replied. Not just the gig, the mission. We don't all get to be comfortable. Not if we care. Steve's face dropped, the resistance fading. The audience watched as the tension shifted, less explosive now, more personal. Two men who had seen too much, done too much, and were now too far apart to pretend it hadn't changed them. You came at me hard, Steve said quietly. Because I still believe you're capable of more, Denzel answered. A beat of silence. Then applause. Not wild. Not forced. Just honest. It was no longer about who was right. It was about who still gave a damn. Steve looked out toward the audience, his eyes glassy now. The weight of Denzel's words didn't just sting, they lingered. He shook his head slowly and spoke, not to Denzel, but to the crowd. You all see me in a suit, on a stage, making folks laugh. But you didn't see me sleeping in my car. You didn't see me get told no by every door in Hollywood. You think I'm tap dancing for white folks? I danced to survive. A few claps, a few nods. But the room was divided. Denzel didn't interrupt. He let Steve speak. That alone shifted the tone. This wasn't war anymore. This was a reckoning. I respect your journey, Denzel said calmly. And I honor your pain. But what I'm saying is, when you made it out, you had a choice. And your voice, it got louder. But it didn't always get braver. Steve finally met his gaze. You want me to be angry. But I built something by being light in the darkness. And I want you to remember, Denzel replied, that sometimes, the light blinds us from the fire still burning. The audience was silent, but they were locked in. Steve paced slowly. You know what scares me, Denzel? If I start shouting like you, I lose them. The audience. The seat at the table. Then it was never your table to begin with, Denzel said, voice like steel. It hit Steve square in the chest. He stopped moving. Denzel continued, softer now. They gave you that chair because you could laugh through the pain. But what happens when you stop laughing? Do they still listen? Steve didn't answer. And that silence said everything. This was bigger than two men arguing on stage. It was about what success demands. What truth costs. And what dignity sounds like when it refuses to entertain. The moderator looked like he wanted to cut to commercial, but he didn't dare. Because for the first time, the show wasn't for ratings. It was for history. Steve turned to the audience again, but this time he wasn't performing. His voice was quieter, but clearer. I get letters, he began. From kids in neighborhoods like mine. They say, Mr. Harvey, you make me laugh when I got nothing to laugh about. And that matters to me. It does. Denzel nodded slowly, almost as if to say, I know. But I've also gotten letters, Steve added, his voice tightening, from folks who say, why don't you speak up? Why don't you say something when it really counts? And that's harder. Denzel leaned in. Because you know they're right. Steve paused. Maybe I hid behind the jokes too long. Maybe I let the suits and studios turn my rhythm into a routine. Now it was Denzel's turn to soften, only slightly. Then break it. Steve looked down, hands folded, and for a beat, it felt like neither of them were celebrities. Just two black men in America, standing at the intersection of legacy and expectation. Denzel spoke again, measured but firm. You have the mic, Steve. Millions listen when you speak. But what are they hearing? Escape? Or courage? I gave them comfort, Steve said, voice cracked. And now it's time to give them confrontation, Denzel replied. A woman in the front row stood up and clapped. Alone. At first. Then another. And another. Soon, it wasn't applause for a joke, it was for the honesty. The audience wasn't there to be entertained anymore. They were there to witness something real. Steve glanced at Denzel, eyes glistening. You ever get tired of being the one who carries the weight? Denzel looked at him. Every day. But I'd rather carry it than pretend it's not there. The two men locked eyes again, no longer as opponents, but as reflections. Steve whispered, more to himself than anyone, maybe it's time to stop dancing. And Denzel, without missing a beat, replied, then let's walk. The crowd was no longer passive. Something had shifted. What started as a confrontation now resembled a reckoning, not just for Steve Harvey, but for every person watching who had ever traded silence for survival. Steve sat back down, slowly, as if every step toward that chair meant shedding a version of himself. He ran a hand over his face, exhaled deeply, and looked directly at Denzel. You ever wonder, he said, voice hoarse, if we're just two sides of the same struggle? You fight by speaking hard truths. I fight by giving people a reason to smile through the storm. Denzel nodded. But the storm's getting worse. And smiles don't stop bullets. That line echoed like a slap across the studio walls. Steve closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them with something different inside, resolve. So what now? He asked. I stop making people laugh. No, Denzel said gently. You start making them listen while they laugh. Steve leaned back. That's a harder trick. But it's the only one worth learning, Denzel answered. The crowd erupted, not in laughter, but in thunderous applause. The kind of applause that comes not from being entertained, but from being awakened. A young woman in the third row stood up and shouted, "Thank you for saying what we feel." Steve looked stunned. Not because she spoke, but because he realized he hadn't heard that kind of praise in years. Not about his suits. Not about his punchlines. But about his purpose. Denzel sat still, calm, powerful, the way a man sits when he's carried generations in his chest. Steve looked at him again and said, "I thought I had to choose between being liked and being honest." "You don't," Denzel replied. "But you have to decide which one matters more when you close your eyes at night." Steve chuckled, not from humor, but from recognition. "Damn. That's heavy." "It's history," Denzel said. "And it's ours." The lights in the studio seemed dimmer now, not because of the setup, but because the mood had shifted. This was no longer a broadcast. It was a confessional. Steve rested his elbows on his knees, fingers laced, eyes fixed on the floor. "You know, I used to pray before every show," he said. "Not for ratings. Not for applause. I prayed that I wouldn't embarrass my grandmother. She raised me on scripture and struggle." Denzel looked over, softened. "She raised you right. She just didn't raise you to forget." Steve lifted his head. "Somewhere along the way, I stopped speaking like her. Like me. I started talking like they wanted me to. Cleaner. Safer. Funnier. And quieter," Denzel added. The truth of that stung, but Steve didn't deny it. He nodded, slow. "I wrapped myself in success so tight, I couldn't even hear myself breathe anymore." "You've still got time to exhale," Denzel said. Steve sat back, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Not from ego. From humility. You're not easy to argue with." "I'm not here to argue," Denzel replied. "I'm here to remind." There it was. Not a takedown. Not an ambush. A reminder, from one man to another, from one generation to another. The moderator, who had been silent for nearly 20 minutes, finally leaned forward. "Gentlemen, I think the world needed to hear this." Steve looked at him. "No. We needed to hear this." The crowd clapped again, slower this time. More meaningful. In the back row, an older man stood, hand over his heart. "Speak like that again, and I'll tune in every night." Steve smiled, genuinely now. Denzel turned to him one last time. "We don't need to agree on how we speak. But we do need to remember why we speak." Steve reached out his hand. Denzel didn't hesitate. They shook, not like entertainers, not like rivals, but like brothers who'd survived different fires. And as the credits rolled on what was supposed to be another late-night segment, millions watching at home sat in silence. Not because it was awkward. But because, for once, it was honest. The handshake lingered longer than expected. Not for show. Not for the cameras. But because it symbolized something neither man had said aloud: forgiveness. Steve cleared his throat and addressed the audience, but his voice had changed. Not in tone, in truth. "I spent years thinking I had to be perfect. Polished. Palatable. But what I needed to be, was present. And I wasn't." No applause this time. Just silence. The kind of silence people hold when they're listening with more than just ears. Denzel stood beside him now, not across from him. He faced the audience too. We all lose ourselves in survival. But survival ain't the end goal. Freedom is. A young man in the front row raised his hand. He couldn't be older than 19. How do we speak truth without getting cancelled? Denzel didn't flinch. By being willing to lose fake friends to find your real voice. The crowd murmured with that. Some clapped. Some nodded. But all understood. Steve turned toward Denzel again. You came on here tonight to confront me. And instead, you reminded me who I was before the lights. And that man, Denzel said, still matters more than the brand you became. Steve's shoulders dropped. You could almost see the weight roll off him. He looked into the camera. To every kid watching, you don't have to trade your truth for a ticket. If they only love you when you're laughing, they don't love you. Boom. That line alone would be clipped, shared, and quoted before the show even finished airing. The moderator finally spoke again, voice cracked. This wasn't a debate. It was a masterclass. And he wasn't wrong. What was meant to be a media moment turned into a movement. Not because two men shouted louder, but because they chose to listen harder. And suddenly the applause returned, not as noise, but as affirmation. They didn't just witness something. They were changed by it. As the final seconds of airtime approached, a stagehand off-camera signaled, 30 seconds left. But no one moved. No one rushed to wrap things up. Because in that moment, no one wanted it to end. Steve took a deep breath, stepped forward, and looked into the lens, not as an entertainer, not as a host, but as a man who'd just been stripped of pretense. I used to think if I wasn't laughing, I was losing, he said. Tonight. I realized if I'm not listening, I'm lying. Denzel nodded behind him, arms crossed, expression firm yet peaceful. The kind of peace that comes after a war not with another person, but with oneself. Steve turned back toward him. You ever wonder what it costs to be real on camera? All the time, Denzel replied. But it costs more to be fake off camera. The audience didn't cheer. They stood. A full standing ovation. Not rehearsed. Not requested. Just real. The moderator stood too, pulling off his earpiece. We're out of time, he said quietly. But it doesn't feel like we are. Denzel stepped up beside Steve, both now facing the crowd and the cameras. We won't always agree, Denzel said. We shouldn't. But we better start disagreeing with purpose. And with dignity, Steve added. The camera slowly zoomed in, capturing not just their faces, but their stance. Side by side. Not in opposition, but in evolution. Then, right before the screen faded to black, Steve turned to Denzel one last time. Next time you come at me, give me a heads up, he joked, a spark of the old Steve returning. Denzel smiled. Next time, you won't need one. Fade out. Black screen. Then, in white text. The loudest truth is often whispered after the lights go out. Two men. One stage. And no script strong enough to contain the truth. Tonight wasn't about jokes. It wasn't about performance. It was about permission, to feel, to speak, to challenge. Denzel didn't come for applause. He came for accountability. And Steve didn't run. He listened. He grew. He stood. If this moment moved you, don't just watch. Live it. Subscribe for more real stories, real voices, and the kind of truth that doesn't need a laugh track.